Okay, this first chapter is going to be about background information. So, background information. And my handwriting is going to be bad. It's bad to begin with, but when I write on this little computer board, it's even worse. So what I'm going to try to do for you in these videos is to sum up the general information. Don't get bogged down in specifics. I just want to give you the general information. As long as you understand it and understand why it's important to you, that's all I want you to do. So don't get bogged down in all the specifics. Look at just the general information. Let's talk about first aid for just a second. Why is it important to know first aid? Well, let me draw out a little chart here for you. So this is going to be our little pyramid. So if you know first aid, you can solve a lot of the problems that occur around your house, around your work, and prevent somebody, possibly, depending on how severe their injury, from having to see a professional like EMS or a doctor, or going to see a doctor's visit. So first aid is the majority of the cases that you experience in your life will require just minimal first aid. So knowing these skills will really help you out. But knowing these skills can also prevent, or at least give somebody more time until EMS arrives. Another percentage will actually have to go to the hospital. And again, first aid is going to be the first step, if you can help these people out, before they have to go to the hospital. So you may give them more time, especially if it's something where they have to go to the ER. So something like CPR or somebody having a stroke, you can extend the amount of time they have by giving them the proper first aid or the proper care. Now there's an extremely small part, and I should have drawn this line a little further up. So let's say this is all hospital here. This little area here is all hospital. So there's an extremely small part of injuries that result in death. But again, by knowing first aid, you might be able to prevent that, especially in the cases of stroke and CPR. Things that are time sensitive and require you to get oxygen out to the tissue. First aid is extremely important. Or even external bleeding or internal bleeding, where time is of the essence. So knowing first aid, all these other steps, you can save somebody's life. You can give them more time. So that's why first aid is important. So most injuries don't require medical care. So another thing I want to talk to you about is having a first aid kit. So we have our first aid kit. Just having one is important, but having it in the right location is even more important, because if it's not in the right location, it's not going to do you any good. I would encourage you to keep it in your car, or a backpack, or a large purse, depending on how extensive your first aid kit is. If you have a fairly large one, I would just keep it in the car. Here's the benefit, is your car is going to be parked at home, so if something happens around the house, you'll have it with you. If you're out on the road, most likely if you're giving first aid to somebody else, it's going to happen as a result as an accident out on the road, or while you're shopping or something along those. But you'll also have it at work. So the majority of places where you may experience somebody that needs first aid, you would have it with you, because most of the time you're in your car, or your car is going to be at one of these locations. So if you're at home, it's parked in your garage, you're out on your sidewalk, if you're out on the highway, it's going to be with you, of course. And if you're at work, you're going to use your car to get to work. But if you don't have a car, then you could use something like a large backpack to always keep it with you. The reason this is important is it's going to give you the proper equipment to help somebody else, to help someone. That's an E there. I know it's hard to see. But it also, you help yourself. You do this by protecting yourself against blood-borne pathogens or other pathogens that you can get from bodily fluids. So that's why having a first aid kit in your car or on your person is extremely important. The only drawback to having your car, especially down here in South Texas, is the heat. So you're going to have to replace items like gloves and face shields and all that good stuff. Anything that has plastic, that heat is going to cause it to deteriorate a lot faster. So you're going to have to replace it more often. So that might get expensive. So you might want to keep it in a backpack if you don't have a car. But again, I think, this is my own personal preference, everybody should have one. But I can't tell you how many times it's come in handy, because most of the accidents I see, especially car accidents, are happening out on the road. And that's the majority of accidents I see. Occasionally I see some at work, and I even see some at home. But most of the severe cases I see where I really need a kit is out on the road with car accidents. So now let's talk about consent. And this is important because we have different types of consent. We have expressed and we have implied. Express consent is somebody that is alert and mentally capable or competent. They can give you consent. And here's a discussion point for your first discussion is, what about somebody that has a concussion? Are they mentally competent? I know a lot of people that have suffered concussions. That should be a C. I know it's hard to tell. People that have suffered concussions or concussed, and they're not mentally competent. Anyway, so somebody can give you express consent. You tell them your level of training, tell them your name, tell them your level of training, and ask them if you can help them, and they say yes because they are alert and mentally competent. And then you have implied, somebody that's unresponsive. It's implied consent, or they're unconscious. A child. Now, a child, you need the parent or guardian to give you consent, but if there is no parent or guardian, then consent is implied. So let's go back to somebody refusing help. Actually, let's talk about that a little bit. So if somebody refuses help, what do you do? Well, the best thing to do if somebody refuses help is to try to convince them again. You can't force it on them. So you can't force the care, and you wouldn't want to, because it might create a fight or some sort of altercation where you might get injured. So the best thing you can do is tell them what's happening. So explain their injuries to them and why you want to give them care. You know, is it a life-threatening injury? Is it severe external bleeding where bright red spurting blood is coming out and you think an artery has been severed? So if somebody refuses help, and then really the main or the best thing you could possibly do, especially if it's life-threatening, before you do anything else, is call 911. Get emergency responders on their way, because even if this person allows you to help them eventually, and it's a life-threatening injury, the EMS have more tools and are more likely to help this person out. So the sooner they can get there, the better. So now refusing help. Let's go back to somebody that's mentally competent. If somebody's concussed and not mentally competent and refuse help, you still wouldn't want to force care on them. But again, talk about this a little bit if you want to as part of your discussion. What do you think? If somebody has a concussion and refuses help, and so they're not mentally competent, so they truly don't understand the danger they're in, is consent implied? That's the big question. I would say I wouldn't refuse it on anybody. I mean, I wouldn't force care on anybody. That's just my own personal opinion. But what do you think? So this could be a good discussion topic. Anyway, let's move on. Once you start giving care, there's a couple things you want to do and don't want to do. You don't want to stop. So abandon. Oops, abandon. I didn't spell that very well. It's hard to read, I know. Try to make that clearer. Abandonment. Alright, so once you start giving care, you don't want to stop. So don't stop. There's only a couple of cases where you would want to stop. You're too exhausted to continue. You want somebody that has the same level to take over for you, same level of training. So if I start giving care, I don't want to stop and then turn it over to somebody that has no idea of what to do or has a lower level of training than me, unless I'm just too exhausted to continue or the scene becomes unsafe. There are a couple of reasons why you would stop, but we're talking about just stopping just because you don't want to give care anymore. So, or somebody that has a higher level of training, definitely want to turn it over to them. So we either want to turn it over same level or higher level, but we don't want to stop unless the only reason you would stop is if you're too exhausted to continue. A higher trained person comes in and takes over for you. The scene becomes unsafe, so by giving care you're endangering your own life. But we're just talking about none of those exist. You just don't want to give care anymore and you stop, and that's considered abandonment. So now let's talk about negligence. So negligence, and what's happening here is you're exceeding your level of training. Let me spell training better. So you exceed your level of training. That's probably the best example I can give of it. So you're not following the standards of care, essentially. So you have standards of care, the principles that you learned, the order of steps that you're supposed to follow. So if you don't follow the standards of care or you exceed your level of training, that's considered negligence. A good example of that would be, let's say somebody, conscious choking victim, I'm trying to get the object out, I can't get the object for them to expel the object so that they can breathe again. Then they go unconscious, so I try unconscious choking skills. I'm still within my level, so I'm okay there. But then all of a sudden I'm like, there is no way I can get this object out, and I decide to give them a tracheotomy. Well, that's above my level of care if I'm just a lay person. So that would be considered negligence, something you would not want to do. And you have a duty to act if you are EMS, police, a nurse. So there are certain people that have a duty to act, but for the lay person, just the average person, you're not required. There's no duty to act. You're not responsible unless it's like a parent to a child. Then you would have a duty to care for that person. So if it's somebody within your care, then you have a duty to act. But if it's just somebody you don't know, there is no duty to act, and so you have the right not to give them care. Now this also goes back, I just want to explain something. Once you decide to care, let's say there's a duty to act and you decide, oh, okay, I have no duty to act, but I'm going to, and you start to give care, you wouldn't want to stop unless somebody with the same level of care takes over for you, or a higher level of care. And of course there are always those situations where the scene becomes unsafe. We already talked about that though. So the last thing I want to talk about are Good Samaritan laws, and all these things like duty to act, negligence, refusing help, implied consent, abandonment, all of those things fall under Good Samaritan laws. So most states have what's called Good Samaritan laws. So as long as you're acting in good faith, you're covered. So that's the gist of it. You're acting in good faith. Well, what does that mean? Well, you don't go above your level of care. So you stay with your level of care. Oops.